All right, my friends, last video lecture. Dun, 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 dun. All right, my friends, so let's get started. So social cognitive theory, so we're taking off our psychoanalytical lens, we're taking off our biological lens, and now we're putting on our social, right, our social cognitive, so more like social cultural. And we also will talk about exploring the self as well. So this is module 63 and 64 kind of put together. So the social cognitive ideals when it comes to personality is that they believe behaviors are from conditioning, observing, modeling, and emphasizing the importance of mental processes. So essentially, it focuses on how we and our environment interact. It's a combination of behavioral and cognitive perspectives. So it's, we're going to see a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy in our abnormal treatment of psychology. So CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, is by far one of the most used therapies up today because it's our mind and our body and how we interact, right? So it's not just cognitive, but it's not just behavior, but it's both, right? So we're putting our social, so they're looking at it through a social lens, but our cognitive behavioral lens, right? And so again, it emphasizes the interactions of our personality, which is our traits, along with our situations, which is nurture, nature, and nurture, nature and nurture, right? Because at the end of the day, that's the debate, right? And of course, so we're going to learn about Bandura. And I would like you to put Bandura's name near our social cognitive perspective. He is a guy we want to know his name, right? So Bandura. And remember, we already know Bandura from the Bobo doll. Yes, everyone's like, that guy. So let's learn a little bit about Bandura and let me see if I can fix this real quick, my friends. Hold on. All right, my people. So real quick, let me try to find my tab bar. Hold on, give me just a second. I fixed the slide though. All right, my friends, I figured it out. And again, I'm not the best editor of videos, so you guys are just gonna have to watch all that mess up through. So let's get going, Bandura. I apologize for the kind of weird font settings. It looks different on my end, but then when it's presenting, sometimes it gets changed. So back to Bandura. So the social cognitive perspective, please put Bandura's name next to it. Remember, Bandura is the Bobo doll. He's the one that we watched how people mimic, and the kid beat up on the same doll that the mom did with the same actions because he observed it, right? And so that's also along with mirror neurons. So the social cognitive perspective is essentially Bandura's realm. And he believed that behavior influenced by interaction between people's traits and their social context. So he believes that there's a constant interaction between our nurture and our nature, right? And personality is developed through four things. He believed that there's an emphasis on interaction of personality and situation. So it all depends what situation you're in. If you're in a situation at work, you could respond differently if you're in a situation in your home. He believed that active processing of information from our social experiences. So we react with our personality from what we've already experienced, right? So if we have dealt with let's say one of our partners cheated on us like a long time ago, right? And our personality will remember that, and it could affect our future situations with trust, right? So that's what he's saying. There's an interaction between, our information that we've already learned along with how it will show later on. He also believed that, we consciously self-generate goals along with our way of regulating it. That also has to do with a part of our personality. And he believes that our development of self-system based on skills, abilities, and attitudes. So essentially, the social cognitive perspective is an interaction of traits in the environment and how they affect your personality. Essentially wrapped up in a bow, my friends. So again, Bandura, super important to know that he is a part of the social cognitive lens. They like to connect his name to that. All right. So now we want to learn about this new vocab word. Okay, so it is reciprocal determinism. Okay, reciprocal determinism. And this falls under the social cognitive perspective as well. So we're still in our same notes. This is just a vocab within our notes. And the social cognitive perspective is it's essentially a theory of that our personalities are shaped by the interaction of these three things: our personality traits, our environment, and our behavior. So think of it as a triangle. And at the top, we have our cognitive factors. So you can think of traits. So think of this as like our biological personality traits interact with our environment, thus interacting with our behavior. Okay. And thus this girl is bungee jumping, but I was trying to get some action going on over here. So her cognitive factors, right? So maybe biologically wise, she has traits that for, extroversion and all these things, right? And then her environmental factors could be, oh, her friends want to go bungee jumping, right? So she's like, okay, right? And then that leads to the behavior. So the behavior, your cognition, environment all work together. They're all connected. So that's reciprocal determinism. Okay. They all are connected. And so just a little, thinking about our social cognitive perspective, and we learn again about our learned helplessness and how this plays a role, right? So when we think of the social cognitive perspective, let's think about it in daily life. So what happens if an uncontrollable bad event happens? COVID-19, my friends, social isolation, perceived lack of control. That's essentially 2020 wrapped in a nutshell, right? And this creates a generalized helpless behavior, right? And you can think about this as, and I think I talked about learned helplessness with Sally, always getting bad grades in math and just constantly receiving negative, stimuli connected. And so self-efficacy is the degree in which we believe in our own capabilities, our self-confidence, and if we are are we able to meet the demands of, are we able to cope? Are we able to figure things out? So our self-efficacy is our belief in ourselves to figure things out, to have the coping skills and the self-confidence to, ask a peer for help or, whatever it may be. But if we have low self-efficacy, and it's essentially like low advocation for yourself, it could lead to learned helplessness, right? Which is where, we feel hopeless and passive and we're unable to avoid repeated aversive events, right? So bad events. So if we don't, so for example, if you know someone who has, and this is actually a high correlation, students who have, or people, I should say, people who have very controlling parents, very, don't let them go out, right? Sheltered, right? When it comes to them trying to advocate for themselves by like sending their own emails to teachers or whatever, they usually have a hard time because they have learned essentially that it almost would be taken care of by other people, but also it develops learned helplessness, right? So that's why, it's always good to have, send your own emails to teachers, get out there, right? Make your own presentations, right? Because it builds your self-efficacy. And, just like, and this brings us back to our other chapters, right, of external locus of control and internal locus of control. So again, more crossover. But remember, right, so this is where it kind of falls, do we have an external locus of control where we let other people decide our fate? Or do we have internal locus of control, which is where usually you have high self-efficacy, where you control your own fate and you're able to make your own decisions and all of that fancy stuff, my friends. So real quick, just assessing our social cognitive perspective, right? Because clearly there has to be critics, obviously. And so the two main criticisms of the social cognitive perspective is it's too limited on its approach and its emphasis on situations. So they claim that everyday life is way more complex than some of these molds that Bandura created, and that multiple factors converge in personality and behavior. And again, it's not specific enough, which is most of the critiques for all the other theories, right? Perspectives. because again, these are perspectives. It's not true for everyone, right? So, and then number two, does not take into account the whole person, focuses on limited areas of personality where learning affects situation, and it doesn't really focus on the self and doesn't involve unconsciousness at all, which is all Freud, right? So Freud's like, excuse me, there's no psychoanalytical perspective on there and internal conflicts. So those are the gripes, or shall I say the criticisms of this perspective, okay? And to finish off our last new topic, I'm going to take a sip of coffee, but this is our self, the self. What is missing in our perspectives of personality, and the self is actually coming up to, it's kind of like newer research. So the self, they're still developing. So this idea of the self is that our self is the center of our personality. It's the organizer of our thoughts, feelings, and actions. It's almost like our inner ego. It's our center of personality. Essentially, it's the self. And again, connects to self-esteem, one's feelings of high or low self-worth, right? And then that also leads to self-serving bias, right? So if you haven't noticed by now, we're never in the wrong, right? So like when you look at a situation, we are the last people we're going to look at for doing something wrong, right? So self-serving bias could come with this perspective theory where it's like we're ready to, perceive ourselves as like the best of the best, right? Like, oh, it can't be my problem, what I'm doing. It's Sally's problem, right? So there is a self-serving bias aspect to the self personality theory. So, and just some things that they talked about. So essentially some benefits and drawbacks with the self. We have high self-esteem. So people with high self-esteem tend to live happier and healthier, cope better with stress, and more likely to persist at difficult tasks, right? So again, when we think of self-esteem, this is a part of our self theory, right? Hello, Dear Diary, sorry to bother you again. And then low self-esteem makes people more likely to put down others and also engage in racist behaviors. Interesting fact. So because usually, if we don't have confidence in ourselves, we tend to radiate that to other people, right? And so if you ever heard of people like giving off good vibes versus bad vibes, people pick up on that. And so anyway, yeah, so these are the self-esteem benefits and drawbacks. And, criticisms of the theory, first of all, it's really new. We don't have too much to study on this yet, and focuses too much on the, situation environment that fails to recognize the person's inner traits. So again, there's always, when we think of our different lenses, like if we think of the cognitive behavioral, Freud will think, it doesn't go too much into the unconscious. And then Maslow's thinking, let's avoid the unconscious, right? So again, they're always going to be butting heads, but doesn't look at influence of unconscious motives, emotional persuasive traits. So again, clearly the self theory is still being worked on. It has a lot of places to go, but, we're still learning about it. And one last few little vocab terms, and this is really interesting. It was always hard to teach these two terms, and I think COVID actually might be a great way of teaching this. So let's learn about it real quick. So we have these two, and this falls under personality types. And so we have individualism versus collectivism. Individualists, they have more emphasis on their independent self. They care only about them. Like essentially, if it's not at their doorstep, they don't care about it. It's all about them. Individualists are very independent. They make their own standards. And so essentially, if you're an individualist, you are in it for yourself, right? And you're all about making yourself, you are the center of it, right? So that's an individualistic culture. And I'm calling it culture first for a reason. And then we have a collectivist culture. And this emphasizes the collective self. This is where we value others just as highly as ourselves. And let me give you an example. America is a very individualistic culture. We thrive on being unique, and we thrive on, making things for ourselves, and we have our own personal values and goals, and, we We have our own guidelines for ourselves, right? And we, no matter at the end of the day, we want to take care of ourselves first. And then there's collectivist cultures, which are, for example, China is it's a very collectivist. They have a very collective culture. And what that means is that they take care of each other just as much as themselves. They do it for each other. So let me just explain to you the whole mask situation with COVID. Other countries aren't having such a hard time making everyone wear masks because people understand that they're doing it for others. Maybe not for themselves, right, personally, but they're doing it for the safety of others. That's why they do it. America's having a hard time because if it's not directly affecting us, we tend to not care as much, right? And it's not a good or bad thing, right? So there's individualist cultures, there's collective, but it's just interesting to think about, right? And so I'd love to talk about this more, next week when we talk about this brainstorm. But just think about that. Like, what do you think about that? Individualistic versus collective cultures. Yeah. And when COVID happened, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a perfect example. So anyway, just wanted to throw that out there. And this is the last slide. You don't have to write anything down. I just wanted you guys, if you feel like this, and just real quick, this is a scale, right? Because we went through all of our lenses today. Right, the trait theories, all nature. We have our Freud psychoanalysis, more on the nature side, but more starting towards nurture. Cognitive, right? So we have our cognitive behavioral that we talked about. We had Maslow, which is more of the nurture side, right? So I just wanted you guys to see on the spectrum of nature versus nurture where all of our lenses are kind of made from. All right, my friends, that's all I got for you. I know you're like, Miss H, my hands are dying, but I look forward to seeing you all and talking about all that we learned. All right, my friends, have a good rest of your day or whatever. If it's late at night and midnight right now, you guys know you shouldn't have waited last minute to do this. Okay, goodbye, my friends.